I jammed my heel into the second boot, grabbed my scanner off the rack, and stepped out of the lander into what the Veth Collective officially classified as one of the most hostile atmospheric environments ever recorded by a crewed survey mission. The fog hit me first. It was thick and yellow-gray, the kind that does not drift so much as press against you, like a wall that keeps leaning. The smell came next, or rather it would have, if my suit filters had not been running at full capacity. My external chemical sensors, however, told the story clearly. Sulfur dioxide at 400 parts per million, hydrochloric acid mist in the lower fog layer, and something the suit computer logged as unclassified corrosive compound, recommend avoidance. I noted it in my field log and walked toward it. My name is Mara Voss. I am a xenogeologist with 12 years of field experience across 9 planetary systems. I hold joint appointments with the Terran Science Directorate and the Veth Collective Survey Division, which is a formal way of saying that I am almost always the only human in the room. On this particular morning, the room was the surface of Dregma Phi, and I was, as usual, alone. The rest of the survey team had stayed on the ship. This was not unusual. Commander Thal had made the decision on the 3rd day of surface operations, after the 2nd probe unit was lost to a vent eruption, and Senior Analyst Sevi had her outer glove eaten through by a surface pool in under 4 minutes. The Veth physiology is not built for this kind of environment. Their skin is thin, their respiratory system's highly sensitive, and their nervous response to chemical exposure is roughly 3 times more acute than a human's, which means that what registers as a mild irritant to me feels, to them, like the surface of their skin is being renegotiated at the molecular level. Thal made a reasonable call. Surface operations would continue through drones and one on-site human surveyor. Me, I had been doing this for 6 months. Dregma IV is a Class 8 hazard-rated world, which is the 2nd highest classification in the Collective's planetary threat registry. A Class 9 is a world so dangerous that no survey team is permitted to enter the atmosphere at all. A Class 8 means that surface operations are technically permissible, provided that the team accepts significant risk of equipment loss, significant risk of structural suit degradation, and, in the registry's precise and deeply uncomfortable phrasing, non-trivial probability of crew fatality. 6 months on a Class 8. I had started to think of the planet almost affectionately. The northern survey grid was my task for the day. I had already completed the southern basin, the eastern ridge system, and most of the central plateau, but the northern vent shelf was still unfinished, and it bothered me the way an incomplete sentence bothers a careful reader. The shelf sat above a cluster of active geothermal vents that pushed heat and chemical compounds up through cracks in the basalt, and the readings I had captured from orbit suggested there was something unusual happening with the mineral stratification down there, something that did not match the surrounding geology. I wanted to understand it. The ground under my boots was dark and slick. Dregma V does not have water in any meaningful sense, but it has a dozen different liquid compounds that serve roughly the same landscape-shaping function. They pool in low areas, flow downhill, erode rock, and carry dissolved minerals from one part of the planet to another. The pools are extraordinarily dangerous. The largest ones registered on my scanner as pH 1.8, acidic enough to begin compromising my suit's outer shell within about 20 minutes of direct contact. I stepped around them with the automatic attention of someone who has been doing it long enough that it no longer requires conscious thought. Above me, the sky was the color of old bruises. The cloud layer sat low and heavy, lit from within by the pale orange glow of the planet's 2 moons, which were not visible as distinct objects so much as felt as a diffuse, warm light filtering through the chemical haze. There was no wind to speak of. The air on Dregmaforvi does not move the way air does on most inhabited worlds. It sits, and it presses, and occasionally a vent eruption sends a column of superheated gas punching up through the stillness, which is the closest thing to weather the planet offers. I had learned to read the vents, not perfectly, and not scientifically enough that I would have published the method, but well enough to know when the ground was building pressure beneath me, and when it was quiet. The vibration frequency changes, very slightly and very slowly, but it changes. And if you have been walking on a particular section of ground for long enough, you begin to feel the difference. On my 4th week of surface operations, that awareness had saved my equipment when I snapped back from a vent cluster about 30 seconds before it blew a column of gas 15 meters into the air. I had noted it in my log as observational pattern recognition. Thal had reviewed the log and marked it, recommend further study of Terran field intuition responses. I reached the northern shelf by mid-morning and set up my survey array. The work was methodical, Plant the sensor stakes at measured intervals, run the ground penetration scanner in overlapping passes, collect atmospheric samples at 3 different elevations, photograph the surface mineral formations, and record voice notes about anything the instruments could not capture. The mineral stratification I had noticed from orbit was even more interesting up close. There was a layer of pale green silicate running through the dark basalt at a depth of roughly 2 meters, and it had a crystalline structure that I had not seen before on this world. I spent nearly 2 hours on that section alone, crouching over my scanner, running test after test, talking to myself about precipitation chemistry in the same quiet, focused way I always do when something genuinely interesting is in front of me. Behind me, 300 kilometers up, the survey ship held its orbital position. Thal would be watching my telemetry feed. Sevi would be logging my sample data as it transmitted. The rest of the crew would be doing what survey crews do during long surface operations, running equipment checks, writing reports, arguing about meal rotations, and trying not to think too hard about the fact that their human colleague was wandering around on a planet that had already destroyed 2 of their best drones. I did not mind the solitude. I never have. The time I had finished the northern shelf and started back toward the lander, my suit had been on the surface for 9 hours and 40 minutes. The outer shell showed minor corrosion on the left shin panel and the right glove cuff, both within acceptable parameters. My water supply was at 30%. My tissot storage was nearly full. My feet were tired in the comfortable, earned way that comes from a long day of useful work, and somewhere in the lower register of my awareness, underneath the professional satisfaction and the mild physical fatigue, there was something else, something quieter and harder to name. I stopped walking for a moment and stood very still. The planet was completely, deeply quiet. Not the silence of an empty room or a muted radio, but the silence of a place that has never contained anything loud, a geological silence built over millions of years of slow chemical transformation. The vent hum was there, low and constant, more vibration than sound. The fog shifted in almost imperceptible currents. The sky pressed down in its bruised, amber-lit way, and the ground sat solid and dark beneath my boots. I breathed in slowly through the suit filters. It reminded me, very strongly, of the Kamchatka lowlands in August. I had spent 3 weeks there 7 years ago, mapping a hydrothermal field for a terrestrial geology project. The air there smelled of sulfur and wet rock. The ground was soft in places and iron-hard in others. The sky was low and gray, and the light came sideways through the cloud. And at night the nearby hot springs made a low, rhythmic hissing sound that I had found, without quite understanding why, deeply restful. I stood on Dregma 4 and let the familiarity of it settle over me for a moment. Then I noted the time, confirmed my heading to the lander, and walked on. When I climbed back through the lander hatch and began the decontamination cycle, Thal's voice came through the comm. Voss. Telemetry showed you stopped moving for approximately 90 seconds at marker 7. Equipment issue? No, I said. I was just looking at the view. There was a pause. The view, Thal repeated. Yes. Another pause. We will review the atmospheric data when you are back aboard. I unsealed my helmet and ran a hand through my hair, which had gone completely flat from the pressure seal. I felt clear-headed and pleasantly tired. My sample storage was full of interesting things. The crystalline silicate layer was going to make for a genuinely good section of the final report. Tell Sevi I have good samples, I said. She is already reviewing your transmission logs, Thal said. She says, and I am quoting directly, that your sample density from the northern shelf is unusually thorough. I smiled. Tell her I had good ground. I ran the final decon cycle, stowed my field kit, and started the lander's ascent sequence. Below me, Dregma shrank slowly from a surface into a landscape, and then into a planet. The chemical haze turned the surface into something soft and amber-lit from above, and for just a moment, before the cloud layer closed beneath me, it looked almost beautiful. Almost, but sincerely. I made a note in my personal log that I would finish before filing the official report, because it was not the kind of thing that belonged in an official report. It said, Day 183 on Dregma 5e, Northern Shelf Survey complete. Mineral stratification anomaly in northern basalt is a genuine find also. This planet is not pleasant to be on, but I think I understand it. There is something honest about a place that is exactly what it says it is. Dregma Afi does not pretend to be hospitable. It makes no promises. It is simply itself, very completely, all the time. I find that easier to work with than places that seem safe and are not. I closed the log, poured the last of my coffee from the thermos I had filled before departure that morning, and watched the planet disappear below the cloud line. 6 months. 183 surface days. The final report was nearly done. 2 more sessions to finish the analysis, 1 week to write the conclusion, and then we would go home. I drank my cold coffee and let myself be satisfied. The engine fault notice came through at 034 ship time, which was, as far as anyone on the crew was concerned, the worst possible moment. We were 3 days out from Dregma Phi, running standard post-survey transit toward the collective relay station at Veth 7, and the ship's main drive had developed what Chief Engineer Oren described, with considerable technical precision, as a thermal calibration fault in the second compression ring that will absolutely not kill us but will absolutely ground us for 72 hours if we do not fix it properly before pushing to full thrust again. Oren had been with the Veth Survey Service for 22 years. He was not a person who exaggerated. If he said 72 hours, it would be 72 hours. We diverted to Transit Station Keleth, which was a mid-size refueling and maintenance hub, about 4 hours off our current heading. It was not a particularly interesting station. It had a repair bay, 2 crew lounges, a commissary that served food from 6 different worlds with varying degrees of accuracy, and a docking arm long enough to accommodate survey-class vessels. It also had, according to the crew rotation board, a combined 27 hours of accumulated leave time spread across the 8-person team, most of which nobody had taken because there had not been anywhere to take it. Thal announced the layover at the morning briefing, with the calm efficiency of someone who is quietly very relieved that the problem had announced itself in transit rather than mid-survey. The crew's reaction was a mixture of exhaustion and restrained celebration. Survey missions are long and demanding, and the end of one is not marked by a single dramatic moment but by a slow accumulation of small releases, filed reports, cleaned equipment, sealed sample containers, and finally, the quiet knowledge that the work is done and you are allowed to stop. I attended the briefing, drank my coffee, and then went back to my quarters to finish the last 2 analysis sections of the final report. I finished the first section in about 3 hours. It covered the geochemical profile of the central plateau and the mineral interaction dynamics I had observed between the surface pools and the underlying basalt. And I was pleased with it, in the way you are pleased with work that took a long time, and came out right. The second section was the northern shelf analysis, and this was where I slowed down. The crystalline silicate layer was still puzzling me. I had the data, I had the samples, the chemistry was clear enough, but the formation pattern did not match any of the standard models for how silicate deposits develop in high-acidity environments, and I kept arriving at the same question. What had caused the lateral stratification? The deposits ran in almost perfectly horizontal bands across nearly 400 meters of exposed basalt face. Lateral stratification at that scale, in that environment, required either a very specific and sustained atmospheric pressure event or a liquid flow system that no longer existed. And if there had been a liquid flow system of that scale, it implied that Dregma IV's surface chemistry had been substantially different at some point in its geological past. I sat with that thought for a while. Then I opened a new document and started writing a supplementary note to the main report, flagging the anomaly for follow-up research. It was not strictly necessary. The survey's purpose had been to assess the planet for resource and habitation potential, not to solve every geological mystery it contained. And the conclusion of that assessment was already written: uninhabitable, recommend exclusion zone, no further crude operations proposed. But the silicate layer deserved a note. Someone, someday, would want to understand it. I wrote the note carefully, cited my data correctly, and added a line at the end recommending that any future remote sensing follow-up should focus on the northern shelf and the surrounding vent cluster. Then I saved the document, closed my field notes, and sat quietly for a moment. The ship hummed around me in its steady mechanical way. The coolant system ran a cycle, which produced a faint, high-pitched hiss that had been bothering me since the first week of the mission. The air recyclers kept the atmosphere at a fixed temperature and humidity that was entirely comfortable and entirely artificial. There was no outside to speak of, only the sealed interior of a vessel moving through a vacuum. And after 183 days of breathing the same filtered air and sleeping in the same narrow bunk, I was aware of the ship's sounds the way you become aware of a persistent noise that you cannot quite ignore and cannot quite identify. I had not slept well in weeks. This was not a new problem. It happened at the end of long field missions, particularly ones that had required sustained solitary surface work. My body adapted very thoroughly to planetary surface conditions and then had difficulty adapting back. The ground of Dregma IV had a very specific vibration frequency, a low, constant resonance from the geothermal activity beneath the crust, and I had slept exceptionally well for most of the mission because of it. The ship did not vibrate like that. The ship had its own sounds and movements, and they were nothing like a planet. I noted this without attaching too much importance to it, finished my coffee, and went to the crew lounge to join the others. The lounge was already reasonably full. Thal was at the far table reviewing repair schedules with Oren. Senior analyst Sevi was on the long bench near the viewport, working through a data summary on her reader. The two junior survey technicians, Kale and Preth, were playing a Veth board game that involved a lot of quiet deliberation and occasional sharp clicks. The ship's medical officer, a calm, unhurried individual named Doss, was making something in the commissary unit that smelled like it was attempting to replicate cinnamon with approximately 60% success. I got myself a fresh cup of coffee and sat down near Sevi. "The Northern Shelf note is in the supplementary file," I said. Sevi looked up. "I saw the preliminary data come through. The silicate layer is unusual, very unusual," I agreed. "There should not be lateral stratification at that scale in that environment, unless there was a historic flow system we have no other evidence for." "I flagged it for the geology division at Collective Central," Sevi said. "They will want to run models." "Good." I settled back with my cup. "They will argue about it for 5 years and then somebody will propose a remote sensing follow-up, and it will get approved and postponed and approved again, and eventually someone will go back and figure it out." "That is how science works," Sevi said, without any irony at all. "It is exactly how science works," I agreed. We sat quietly for a moment. Through the viewport, the transit lane showed its usual pattern of distant stars and the occasional navigation buoy light. The station at Kelath was still a few hours ahead, a small cluster of warm lights that would gradually resolve into a structure and then a docking port. I looked at the stars for a while, which was something I always did at the end of a mission, because after months of looking at a surface, the sky felt very large. Sevi set down her reader. "You are not sleeping," she said. It was not a question. "I am sleeping." "You are sleeping approximately 4 hours per ship cycle based on your cabin light log and your commissary access times," Sevi said. "That is significantly below your recorded baseline." I looked at her. "You checked my cabin light log?" "I am a data analyst," Sevi said, with the reasonable calm of someone who genuinely cannot understand why this might be surprising. "Also, Doss asked me to check." I glanced over at Doss, who was extracting something from the commissary unit and had the focused expression of a person who is absolutely aware they are being discussed. "Tell Doss I am fine," I said. "Doss will want you to tell Doss that yourself," Sevi said. I accepted this because it was true. Doss was the kind of medical officer who asked calm, direct questions and waited for complete answers, and there was no comfortable way to deflect them. I would go talk to Doss. But not yet. Sevi picked up her reader again, then paused. "What is your ideal rest environment?" she asked. "For sleep." "On a planet, not on a ship." I considered this. It was an oddly specific question, and I was not entirely sure what had prompted it, but Sevi's questions were always specific for a reason, and the reason usually became clear later. "Somewhere dark," I said. "A little humid, dense atmosphere. Not too cold, but not warm either. Some kind of ambient sound from geological activity. A low hum or a steady vibration, something consistent. A surface with some mass to it, not a mattress but actual ground." Sevi was looking at me with an expression that was very still. "What?" I said. She said. She picked up her reader. "Thank you." I watched her go back to her data summary. Her stylus was not moving, staring at the screen without reading it. I waited for her to say whatever she was thinking, but she did not say it. And after a moment her stylus began to move again, and the moment passed. I finished my coffee and sat with the stars for a while longer. The ship hummed. The coolant cycled. Kale and Preth clicked their game pieces across the board. Somewhere behind me, Doss produced a plate of something that smelled like it was trying to be a pastry and succeeded just enough to be interesting. It was a perfectly comfortable evening. I could not sleep that night. I lay in my bunk and listened to the ship's sounds and thought about the silicate layer in the northern shelf and the question of the historic flow system. I ran through the chemistry in my head, the way I often do when I cannot sleep, following each logical step carefully, checking my reasoning. The basalt composition, the acid concentration in the surface pools, the temperature differential between the vent zones and the surrounding plateau, the crystalline structure of the silicate. Outside the viewport above my bunk, the stars did not move. I thought about Kamchatka, the smell of sulfur and rain, the specific quality of silence that comes from a landscape that is geologically alive. full of small sounds and vibrations that never stop but never become intrusive. I thought about lying in a tent on the slope of a cold hill with the hot springs hissing in the distance and feeling, completely and without complication, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I turned onto my side and stared at the wall. The ship hummed. The stars stayed still. I did not sleep until nearly dawn. I was 3 hours into writing the conclusion of the final report when Thal knocked on my cabin door. This was unusual. Thal communicated almost exclusively through the ship's internal messaging system, which was efficient and thorough, and very much in keeping with her general approach to leadership. A physical knock meant something that she had decided required a human face attached to it. "Come in," I said. Thal entered and stood near the door with a particular upright stillness that I had learned, over 6 months, indicated careful consideration rather than tension. She was tall for a Veth, which meant she cleared the doorframe with about 2 centimeters to spare, and her secondary eyes, which the Veth used primarily for peripheral light sensing, were oriented forward, which meant she was paying close attention. "We are 6 hours from completing the repair cycle," she said. "I have confirmed departure clearance with Keleth Station Control. We will resume transit to Veth 7 this evening." "Good," I said. "I should have the conclusion finished by then." Thal was quiet for a moment. This was also a thing she did. She held space to conversation deliberately, as if giving words room to land before adding more. "I reviewed your survey log from the final surface operation," she said. "The stop at marker 7. I told you, I was looking at the view." "You said that," Thal agreed. "I have been thinking about what it means." I leaned back from my screen. "It means I stopped walking for a minute and looked at the planet." "Yes." Thal's secondary eyes shifted slightly. "You have made 19 personal log entries over the course of this mission that include observational comments about the surface environment of Dregma IV, not geological observations, personal ones." I looked at her for a moment. "You read my personal logs?" "The emotional well-being of crew members is my responsibility," Thal said. "I do not read them in detail. The ship's support system flags entries that meet certain criteria, and I review the flags." "What criteria?" "Repeated references to a specific environment paired with elevated contentment indicators in the physiological data." I stared at her. "Your cortisol levels during surface operations on Dregma IV," Thal continued, very carefully, "were consistently lower than your baseline. Your sleep duration during the mission's early weeks, before you fully adapted to ship rest cycles, was longer and more restorative than at any other point in your recorded deployment history." The cabin was very quiet. "I slept well on the surface," I said, "because the geothermal vibration was consistent and restful." "Yes," Thal said, "I understand that. I have also been reviewing your Earth environmental baseline data for context." She paused. I had not previously looked at it in detail. Her expression, which I had learned to read with reasonable accuracy over the course of a long mission, was doing something I could only describe as very controlled, not alarmed. More like someone who has opened a door expecting a small room and found something that goes back a very long way. "Thal," I said, "what exactly did you look up?" "Kamchatka," she said, "which you mentioned in a log entry. And then several of the other locations you have referenced in your personal records over the course of this mission." She paused again. "I looked at the geochemical profiles of your home planet's more extreme surface environments." I waited. "Mara," she said, which was the first time in the entire mission she had used my given name. "Your planet has hot springs that are almost chemically identical to the surface pools on Dregma 4. Less concentrated," I said. "But yes, roughly. People go to them. Some of them are tourist destinations." Thal was quiet for a considerably longer moment than usual. Then she said, "I am going to need some time to think about this." "Take all the time you need," I said. She nodded once, turned and left. The door closed behind her with a soft click. I turned back to my screen and looked at the conclusion I had been writing. I added 1 sentence to it before closing the document. Then I went to the lounge to find Sevi, because I was beginning to understand what that very still expression had been about the evening before, when I described my ideal sleep environment, and I thought it was probably time to have that conversation directly. Sevi was at her usual seat, and when I sat down across from her, she looked up with the expression of someone who has been waiting patiently. "You pulled the Dregma IV atmospheric data," I said. "Last night." "Yes," she said, and compared it to my description. "The match was 91% across the main variables," she said. "Atmospheric density, ambient sound profile, temperature range, ground resonance frequency." She set her reader flat on the table. "Mara, you described a Class 8 hazard-rated planet as your ideal rest environment." "I did not say ideal," I said. I said I liked a low hum in dense air and geological activity. Those are the defining characteristics of Dregma, Phi A. They are also the defining characteristics of about a dozen places on Earth that people visit for their health. Sevi looked at me with an expression that was trying very hard to locate the correct emotional register for the information she was processing. I ran a secondary check, she said. On Earth geological tourism. You went to bed instead of talking to me, I said. You were up all night researching. I do not sleep the way you do, she said, which was true. The Veth have a rest cycle that involves about 2 hours of something that functions like sleep, and 6 hours of a low-activity metabolic state that is somewhat like resting, but does not require full unconsciousness. I found a record of a location called Kawah Ijen. In Indonesia, I said. Yes. People climb into an active volcanic crater. For the view, I said. And the blue fire. For the view, Sevi repeated with great care. The sulfur miners go for the sulfur, I added. But most tourists go for the view and the fire. Sevi looked at me for a long moment. Then she picked up her reader, held it toward me and said, the Dregma surface pool we recorded at the secondary site in the eastern basin had a pH of 1.8. Yes, I said. Kawah Ijen Crater Lake has a recorded pH of a 0.5. Dregma Phi is actually milder in that respect. Sevi put her reader down very slowly. I am going to tell Thal about this. She already knows, I said. She came to see me this morning. How did she seem? Like someone who had opened a door expecting a small room, I said. Sevi nodded once, as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. Then she said, with the straightforward precision that I had always appreciated in her. When you said last night that you wanted dense air and geological ambient sound and ground resonance, were you aware that you were describing Dregma Forvi? I thought about it honestly. Not entirely, I said. Not consciously. I was thinking about Kamchatka. Kamchatka, Sevi said, also has a volcanic acid lake. It does, I agreed. It is called Kronotskoy. Very beautiful in the morning light when the sulfur fog burns off. Sevi closed her eyes for a moment. Not in distress, I thought, but in the manner of someone cataloging a very large piece of information and deciding where to put it. When she opened them again, she said, You have been sleeping badly on this ship. Yes, because it is too quiet. Because the resonance profile is wrong, I said. The ship hums, but it does not vibrate. The Dregma IV surface had a specific low-frequency oscillation from the geothermal layer beneath the crust, somewhere between 12 and 16 hertz. Infrasound, essentially, very consistent, very steady. I paused. Earth has places that do the same thing. Hot spring fields, vent zones, certain coastal areas with particular tidal patterns. I have always slept well in those places. Sevi was quiet for a long moment. You find a Class 8 hazard-rated planet restful, she said. Parts of it, yes, I said. The chemistry is hostile, obviously. The surface is dangerous. I am not saying it is safe. I am saying it is familiar in a way that the ship is not. You are, saying Sevi said slowly, that the most dangerous planetary environment we have surveyed in the last 4 years is familiar to you because it resembles places humans visit voluntarily for recreation. I thought about how to answer this in a way that was accurate without being unnecessarily alarming. I could not find one. More or less, yes, I said. Sevi picked up her reader and set it down again. She did this twice. Then she said, I am going to tell Das about this. Please do not turn this into a crew briefing, I said. I am not going to turn it into a crew briefing, she said. I am going to tell Das because Das is the medical officer and this seems like medical information. This was reasonable and I could not argue with it. I went to get more coffee. Behind me, I heard Sevi's reader chirp as she opened a message to Das. I made a note to myself to stop by the medical bay later and preempt whatever concerned conversation Das had planned with a calm, clear explanation. The ship continued its quiet hum. The repair cycle ticked down toward completion. Outside the viewport, the stars held their positions with the absolute stillness of deep space. I drank my coffee and felt the specific, low-grade restlessness of a person whose body has decided that the available environment is not quite right, and reminded myself that it was only a few days to Veth 7, and from Veth 7 it was 6 weeks to Earth, and from Earth it was a short flight to Iceland, where there was a geothermal field I had been meaning to revisit for 3 years, and where I would, I was absolutely certain, sleep like I was made of stone. The briefing happened anyway. I had made my preemptive visit to Das, who had listened to my explanation with attentive calm, and then asked 3 questions, the last of which was, and this is a pattern you have observed across multiple field deployments. I said yes. Das made a note and said that the information would remain in my medical file. I thanked them. I left. I returned to my cabin and finished the conclusion to the final report with a clear conscience. Then Thal called a voluntary information session for anyone who wanted to attend, framed as a discussion of cross-species environmental adaptation in long-duration survey deployments. Every member of the crew attended voluntarily in under 4 minutes. The session took place in the main briefing room, which was a functional, mid-sized space with a curved display wall and seating for 12. Thal stood at the front with her hands folded. Sevi sat in the first row with her reader. Oren was still technically running diagnostics on the repaired drive unit, but had sent a subroutine to manage that and was sitting in the back with the look of someone who had received a summary and come to confirm it in person. Kale and Preth were in the middle row, side by side, and they had the expression of junior crew members who had overheard something they needed the adults to contextualize. Doss was at the back, taking notes. I sat next to Sevi in the front row, because it seemed more honest than sitting in the back and pretending I was not the subject of the session. Thal said, without preamble, "I want to share some information I have gathered about Terran environmental baseline conditions, and discuss how that information contextualizes aspects of this mission that I think the crew deserves to understand." She pulled up the first display. It was a side-by-side comparison of Dregma IV's surface atmospheric data and the geochemical profile of several Earth locations. The columns were labeled with both the planetary designation and the Earth location name, and someone, I suspected Sevi, had added a percentage match figure in the margin. The Kamchatka comparison was at 88%. Rotorua in New Zealand was at 79. Iceland's Reykjanes Peninsula was at 82. Kale leaned toward Preth and said something very quietly. Thal continued. She was precise and thorough, as she always was, and she had clearly spent time thinking about how to present this information in a way that was informative without being sensationalist. She explained the geochemical comparisons. She explained the sleep and cortisol data from my biosign records. She explained the concept of infrasound resonance and its role in human rest cycles, with a citation from a Terran neuroscience paper she had apparently found and read in the past 12 hours. Then she showed the Kawa eGen entry. The room went very quiet. "This is a currently active tourist destination," Thal said, "on the island of Java on the planet Earth. Visitors descend into an active volcanic crater on a path that crosses active sulfur mining operations. The crater contains a highly acidic lake. The activity is described in Terran travel literature as," she checked her notes, "challenging but rewarding." Oren in the back made a sound. It was not quite a word. "The Terran survey briefing I received before this mission," Thal continued, "described Dr. Voss as an experienced field researcher with excellent environmental adaptability." She paused. "I now understand this description more fully than I did at the time. I decided this was the moment to contribute. I want to be clear," I said, "that I am not saying Dregma IV is safe. It is not safe. The survey protocols were correct, and Thal's decision to keep surface operations to a single on-site researcher was the right one. But," Sevi said, "but the planet is not alien to me in the way it is to Veth physiology. The environmental stress that would be genuinely harmful to a Veth crew member is within tolerance for a human who grew up on a geologically active world. That is a physiological and evolutionary difference, not a matter of personal bravery or exceptional ability. Your planet," Oren said from the back, "has active volcanoes, about 1,500 active and dormant ones currently tracked," I said, "and you have cities near them. Naples has been occupied more or less continuously since around the 9th century before our current calendar. It sits at the base of Mount Vesuvius. Population approximately 3 million. Oren absorbed this for a moment. "Why? The soil is very good for growing things," I said. "Volcanic mineral deposits make excellent farmland." Preth raised a hand, which I found charming. I nodded. "You said the geothermal sound helped you sleep," Preth said. "The infrasound. That is why you did not sleep well on the ship." "Yes. Can we add something to your cabin environment? Some kind of resonance generator?" I looked at Preth for a moment, surprised and genuinely touched. "That is a very thoughtful idea," I said. "I think it would probably help." Thal made a note. Sevi looked at the display wall and then back at me. "The Southern Acid Springs on Dregmafur," she said, "the secondary survey site. The pool's at pH 1.8. You walked past them every day for 3 weeks. Careful route," I said. I gave them a wide margin. "You did," Sevi agreed. She pulled up the route logs on her reader. "An average margin of approximately 4 meters, which is cautious," I said. "Given suit tolerance, a 4-meter margin from a pH 1.0 acid pool," Sevi said, "is not what I would describe as a wide margin. It is a reasonable or operational margin for the equipment specifications." "Doss," Sevi said without turning around. "I am noting it," Doss said from the back. So I decided not to argue. The margin had been fine, I had been fine. But I understood that from the perspective of a crew whose outer glove had been compromised in 4 minutes of contact, 4 meters from a pH 1.8 pool was a different kind of statement. Thal let the session run for another 20 minutes. There were questions, all of them thoughtful, and most of them about Earth. Kale asked about tectonic activity, and I explained the Pacific Ring of Fire, which produced an expression of concentrated stillness that I was beginning to recognize as the Veth equivalent of a stunned silence. Oren asked about the methane bogs of northern Canada and whether humans could survive in them unassisted, and I said yes, with appropriate clothing, at which point Oren said something in Veth that Sevi did not translate. At the end of the session, Thal thanked everyone and closed the display. The crew filed out in the particular quiet of a group that has been given a great deal to think about. Sevi lingered. When the room was empty, she said, "Do you miss it? The surface." "It has only been 3 days," I said. "That is not what I asked." I thought about the flat basalt shelf above the northern vent cluster, the low constant hum, the amber-lit stillness, the 9-hour survey day that had left me clear-headed and pleasantly tired in a way that 2 weeks of ship transit had not. "Yes," I said honestly, "a bit." Sevi nodded slowly. "I have been trying to imagine what your planet is like," she said, "based on the data I have seen this week. I cannot quite build the picture. It is loud," I said, "and busy and warm in the populated places. But the places I go for fieldwork are very quiet and very old, and they smell like the ground, which is a specific kind of smell that I cannot really describe to someone who has not encountered it, like hot minerals and cold rain at the same time, like a world still figuring itself out." "Dregma V smells like that," Sevi said, "according to your external chemical sensors." "Almost," I said. "The chemistry is different, but almost." Sevi was quiet for a moment. Then she said very carefully, "When we return to Veth 7 and you continue to Earth, I hope you have a very good rest." "Thank you," I said. "I will." She gathered her reader and left. I sat in the empty briefing room for a moment, looking at the blank display wall, where a few minutes ago, side-by-side columns had quietly argued that I was, by some measurable standard, better matched to a Class 8 hazard planet than anyone in my crew. I did not find this alarming. I found it faintly interesting, the way geological anomalies are interesting. Not because they are threatening, but because they suggest the world is more varied and more intricate than any single model can account for. I went back to my cabin. The resonance generator, it turned out, was something Oren had already begun rigging by the time I reached the corridor outside the engineering bay. He was not a person who let useful problems stay unsolved. When I thanked him, he said, without looking up from the circuitry, "Tell me what frequency." I told him 12 to 16 hertz, low amplitude, constant without rhythm. He made an adjustment, ran a test pulse, and asked me if it felt right. I stood in the corridor and felt the faint vibration come up through the floor plating, and said yes, that was close. And he adjusted it twice more until I said, that was it exactly. That night I slept for 9 hours. I did not dream, or if I did not remember it, which is the best kind of dreaming. In the morning my mind was clear and my body felt rested in the honest way that comes from real sleep, and I lay still for a few minutes before getting up, listening to the gentle pulse of the resonance generator and thinking, not for the first time and not unhappily, that I am a creature of a specific and somewhat unusual world, and that the universe, at its most dangerous and most honest, sometimes feels surprisingly like home. What I did not expect was the detour. We were 2 days out from Veth 7, which meant we had passed the transit waypoint and entered the final leg of the return journey, and the crew had settled into the comfortable, slightly restless mood of people who are nearly done with something long. Thal was finishing the mission summary documentation. Sevi was compiling sample manifests. Oren had performed so many maintenance checks on the repaired drive unit that Preth had started timing them for personal amusement. I had submitted the final report, including the supplementary note on the northern shelf silicate layer, and was in the early stages of doing nothing in particular, which is something I find more difficult than most people assume. I was in the lounge rereading a field geology paper I had already read twice when Thal appeared in the doorway. "I want to discuss a route adjustment," she said. I looked up. "The Northern Shelf Survey," she said. "Your supplementary note flagged the silicate stratification as requiring follow-up documentation. You noted that the data you collected was thorough, but that a second pass from a different angle would significantly improve the sample profile. That was a recommendation for a future mission," I said. "Yes," Thal said. but we are currently 4 hours from Dregma 5V if we take the inner transit lane rather than the outer one. I set down the paper. I have filed a route adjustment with the Transit Authority for what I have described as a supplementary geological documentation stop, Thal said. It has been approved. We can hold orbit for 6 to 8 hours and conduct a final ground survey if you feel the scientific value justifies it. The lounge was very quiet. Through the viewport, the stars were doing what stars do. Thal, I said. The drive repair was flawless, she said before I could continue. Oren is confident in full thrust capacity. The detour adds approximately 11 hours to our transit time, which is within mission discretion parameters. There is no operational reason not to do this if it serves the scientific record. She was standing in the doorway with her hands folded and her secondary eyes oriented forward, and she was looking at me with the expression I had learned to read over 6 months of working closely together. The one that meant she had made a decision after careful consideration and was not interested in being talked out of it. You do not have to do this, I said. I am aware, she said. I am doing it because the science is incomplete. And also because you have not slept a full night on this ship since the resonance generator was installed except for the night immediately following. And I noticed things. I looked at her for a moment. Thank you, I said. She nodded. You have 4 hours to prepare your survey kit. I suggest you also eat something before departure. She left. I sat in the quiet lounge for a moment longer, and then I went to prepare my kit. The descent to Dregma Phi the second time felt different from every other descent I had made over the course of the mission. All 183 previous surface days had been work. Purposeful, focused, professionally motivated. This one was also work, because I genuinely did intend to complete the second pass documentation on the northern shelf, and the scientific value was real, and I was going to do it properly. But underneath the work, carried alongside it like a second frequency beneath the primary signal, was something simpler and harder to categorize. I was going back. The lander broke through the cloud layer, and the surface opened beneath me, dark and amber-lit and absolutely still. The chemical haze moved in its slow, pressured way across the landscape. The geothermal vents put their faint heat columns up into the lower atmosphere. The pH2 pools sat in their low basins and caught the diffuse moonlight and held it in their slightly luminous surfaces. It looked, as it always had, like a place that was very seriously itself. I landed on the flat shelf above the northern vent cluster, which I had identified on my approach as the best position for the second pass documentation work. I ran through the decontamination check, confirmed suit integrity, and stepped outside. The ground met my boots with that solid, unambiguous pressure. The hum came up through the soles immediately, 12 to 16 hertz, constant and unhurried, the deep rock resonance of a geologically active world doing what it has always done and intends to keep doing for a very long time. The fog pressed in around me in its yellow-gray way. The chemical sensors reported their readings, same as always. I stood still for a moment and just breathed. Then I got to work. The second pass documentation went smoothly and well. I had a clearer sense of the northern shelf from my first survey, and I knew exactly which angles and elevations I needed to improve the sample profile. I moved methodically through the survey grid, placing sensors, running scans, collecting samples from the silicate layer at 3 additional points along the stratification band. The data coming in was good, genuinely good, the kind that fills in the picture rather than merely confirming what you already knew. The historic flow system hypothesis was looking stronger. There was a subtle topographic depression running parallel to the silicate band that I had not mapped in detail during the first survey, and it fit the pattern of an ancient riverbed in a way that made my pulse quicken in the particular way it does when geology starts to tell a story. I recorded everything carefully and talked to myself about it quietly as I worked, the way I always do. 3 hours into the survey, I finished the documentation pass and began collecting the final sample set. The vent cluster below my position was cycling through its regular pressure pattern, and I could feel the variation in the ground vibration as it built and eased, built and eased. I had missed this. I had not fully acknowledged that I had missed it until I was standing on the ground, feeling it again. But now that I was here, it was obvious. The ship's resonance generator was good. Oren had done excellent work. But a machine approximation of a frequency is not the same as the frequency itself. The way a recording of rain is not the same as rain. The work was done within 4 hours. I confirmed my sample inventory, stored my sensors, and ran a final check of the survey data transmission to the ship. Everything had come through cleanly. Sevi would have good data to work with. I looked at my suit timer. I had approximately 3 hours before the lander would need to begin its ascent window. I walked to the flat section of basalt shelf that I had identified on my approach, the broad, slightly elevated platform that sat directly above the main vent cluster, where the ground resonance was strongest and most consistent, and where the rock had been worn smooth by millions of years of thermal cycling. I sat down. The basalt was solid under me. The vent hum came up through it clearly. That deep low frequency that the Veth Hazard Registry did not include in its threat assessment, because it was not a chemical hazard or a physical danger. Just a fact of the planet, a geological heartbeat. The fog sat around me in its steady pressing way. The amber moonlight came through it in that diffuse, sourceless manner that made the whole surface glow faintly from no particular direction. I set my wake alarm for 2 hours and 45 minutes. I lay down on the basalt. I closed my eyes. Aboard the ship, Sevi was watching the biosign feed. My location was marked on the surface map, stationary on the northern shelf, which was expected. My suit telemetry was nominal. My external sensors were logging normal Class 8 readings. Elevated corrosive particulate in the fog, geothermal heat output from the vent cluster below my position, ground resonance at consistent amplitude. All of this was familiar data. What was not familiar was the biosign readout: heart rate, 54 beats per minute, respiratory rate, 12 breaths per minute, brainwave activity, shifting from alert to the first stage of deep sleep within approximately 8 minutes of her lying down. Sevi watched the readout for a long moment. Then she opened a channel to the medical bay. "Doss," she said quietly. "I see it," Doss said. They had apparently been watching the same feed. "She's asleep," Sevi said. "She has been trying to sleep for 3 weeks," Doss said. "She is asleep." Sevi turned back to the feed. On the surface of Dregma IV, a Class 8 hazard-rated world that had destroyed 2 survey drones and partially compromised a senior analyst's outer glove, and spent 6 months being the most hostile environment the Veth Collective Survey Division had surveyed in the current decade, Dr. Mara Voss was sleeping on a basalt shelf with the serene, complete stillness of a person who is exactly where their body has been asking to be. The planet's outer atmosphere continued to press against the suit's corrosion layer at its usual rate. The pH2 pools sat in their basins at a safe distance. The vent cluster hissed and pulsed. Oren had come to the bridge at some point and was leaning against the doorframe, watching the telemetry screen. Thal was at her station with her hands very still. Kale and Preth were in the doorway behind Oren, not quite entering. Nobody said anything for a while. Then Kale, very quietly, said to Preth, "She is napping." "On a Class 8 planet," Preth said. "On a Class 8 planet," Kale confirmed. They were quiet again. Thal opened the mission log and made an entry. She wrote it carefully and read it back twice before saving it. It said, "Supplementary mission note, return transit. A second survey pass of the Dregma far northern shelf was completed successfully. Additional data on the silicate stratification anomaly is on file for future analysis." Dr. Voss completed the survey pass and subsequently rested on the planetary surface for approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes. Her biosign readings during this rest period were the most positive recorded at any point in the mission. This officer notes that the Terran environmental baseline assessment included in crew preparation materials requires significant revision, and that future joint survey deployments should consider Terran physiological parameters before classifying surface environments as unsuitable for habitation. Recommend specialist consultation with Terran Science Directorate before final environmental ratings are issued for any world with geothermal activity. She saved the entry and looked at the telemetry screen. 54 beats per minute, 12 breaths per minute, deep sleep. Outside, the planet did what it always does. The wake alarm went off at the 2-hour 45 mark, and I came up out of the deepest sleep I had managed in 3 weeks, with the clean, immediate alertness that good sleep produces. I lay still for a moment, registering the ground under me, the hum in the rock, the amber light above, the fog pressing in with its chemical weight. Everything was exactly as it should be. My suit was intact. My samples were secured. The planet was being exactly itself. I sat up and rolled my shoulders and checked my suit timer and confirmed the ascent window. Then I radioed the ship. "Ready for extraction," I said. "Good nap." There was a pause. Then Sevi's voice came through, and she sounded in the way that Veth people sometimes sound when they are holding something careful in their voice. Very composed. "Confirmed," she said. "Lander cleared for ascent on your signal." I started the lander. Below me as I ascended, the northern shelf passed out of sight beneath the cloud layer. The basalt shelf, the vent cluster, the pH2 pools sitting in their basins, the silicate stratification in the rock face that had told me, in its quiet geological way, about a river that used to run through this place a very long time ago. I broke through the cloud layer into the pale space between atmosphere and orbit, and then I was above the planet, and below me it was an amber and gray-brown sphere with its chemical haze sitting on it like a blanket, and it looked the way it always looked from here, like a place that was very seriously and completely itself, not hospitable by most definitions, not designed for visitors, not soft or accommodating or gentle in any way. I found it beautiful. The ship appeared ahead in its orbital position, and I aligned the lander and began the docking approach. In my sample storage, the silicate specimens from the second pass were carefully labeled and sealed. In my field recorder, the data from the revised survey grid was complete. The supplementary report would take me about 2 days to write, and it would be the best part of the mission documentation, because the data was genuinely interesting and the hypothesis it pointed toward was one that nobody had proposed for Dregma IV before. I docked, ran the decon cycle, unsealed my helmet, and walked through the airlock into the ship. Sevi was waiting in the corridor. We looked at each other for a moment. "Good data?" she said. "Very good data," I said. "The flow system hypothesis is looking strong. The topographic depression I mapped on the second pass fits perfectly. There was water here once, Sevi, or something very much like it. The chemistry would have been extraordinary." Sevi looked at me for a moment longer. Then she said, "I am glad you got a good nap." "The best one in 3 weeks," I said. She fell into step beside me as I headed toward the equipment bay to stow my kit, and she said, in the casual, precise way she had when she was arriving at a conclusion she had been working toward for some time, "I have been thinking about what you said. About Earth. About places that are honest." I said. "Dregma Phi is honest," she said. "It's not greed, it does not. You find that restful." "I find it familiar," I said, which for me amounts to the same thing. Sevi was quiet for the length of the corridor. Then she said, "I would like to visit Earth someday." I looked at her. She was reading her own reader as she walked, and her expression was composed and thoughtful, and she said it in the same tone she used to report geological data, flat and precise and completely sincere. "I think you would find it very interesting," I said carefully. "I expect I would find it terrifying," she said, "but that is also interesting." I considered this and decided it was the best answer anyone had ever given to that particular invitation. Later that evening, I sat in my cabin with the resonance generator running at 12 Hz and wrote the final entry in my personal mission log. It was not a scientific entry, and it would never appear in any report or archive, and I wrote it the way I write the things that are just for me, without trying to make it sound more formal than it is. It said, "End of Dregma mission. 6 months, 183 surface days. The work was good and the data is solid, and the silicate anomaly is the most interesting geological find I have made in 4 years. I slept on the surface today for almost 3 hours, on a basalt shelf above a vent cluster, and it was the best sleep I have had since we left the outer relay 7 months ago. My crew was watching my biosign feed the whole time." Thal updated the mission log. "Sevi told me she wants to visit Earth. Oren built me a resonance generator that is genuinely very good. Kale and Preth asked me 14 questions about volcanoes over dinner, and I answered all of them." I paused and thought about how to finish it. Then I wrote, "I have been asked several times over the past week whether I am all right, and whether the planet was difficult, and whether I am glad to be leaving. I am all right. The planet was not difficult in the way they mean, though it was not easy in the logistical sense. And I am glad to be heading home, because I miss the sounds and smells of Earth in the way you miss things that are yours, the way you miss the specific quality of rain on a particular kind of soil, or the exact vibration of ground above a hot spring field, or the light at 6 in the morning when the sulfur fog is burning off over a black rock valley, and the sky is going that particular shade of orange that no other planet quite manages. But I am also glad I was here. Dregma IV is honest and old and completely itself, and there is something in the geology that I do not yet fully understand, and that is the best reason there is to be anywhere." I saved the log and closed my screen. The resonance generator hummed at 12 Hz, steady and constant, a good approximation of something true. Outside the viewport, the stars were very still. I turned off the light and went to sleep.